we also, I think, mentioned about how these play spaces have become bleak and not very good and built to protect children from the city. But there have been other spaces that have been built as constructed spaces, and I want to bring to your attention adventure playgrounds. Some of you may know of these. So the first one was built in Denmark, in Emdrup, in 1943. And on a field trip once, I encouraged some students to come with me to visit it. I think it's quite different from how it was when it was first built, because it was built during the war, and it had somebody who was a teacher who decided that children needed somewhere safe in the midst of everything that was going on. But somebody called Lady Allen of Hurtwood, who was, she's a lady, so she's not a poor lady, she's an establishment figure, but she had a great heart for children in many ways, and she was very keen to put their rights forward. She was also the first fellow of the Institute of Landscape Architects in our country, and not a lot of people know that, and I think that's really great that the first fellow was somebody who was concerned about children's environments. And this is what Emdrup sort of looks like. It has a combination of spaces, so it has a nice big grass space, has small gardens with little huts so the children can have a garden each. It has a little homemade skate ramp area. It's got an area for growing things, so this is looking through those gardens again, sitting out areas. It has a whole range of things, and then here's an area where children can make things. So this is one of the traditional things in an adventure playground, that you can go and actually make something. So there's lots of bits of wood, and then in the middle is a fire pit. So another thing that adventure playgrounds and the people who work there love is that children can actually go and have a bonfire or cook marshmallows or food over it. Okay. And some of these in our country have been used for after-school clubs for children as a very different approach from some of the more formal indoor after-school clubs. But traditionally, an adventure playground should have a member of staff there, partly for safety reasons as well. So these are all different aspects of Emdrup. One of the issues in our country now that has constructed spaces, and we've had some new ones built and some old ones refurbished under the One Government funding programme, was one of them that was refurbished quite in the city next to us, they then couldn't use because they didn't have the money to pay the staff. So that was a complete waste really, but I haven't done that. So Lady Allen of Hurtwood talked about different types of constructed spaces. So play parks, and I don't think play parks exist very much in the UK now, but just parks that are fully for children to play in. So these are just some pictures of play, which I think we've seen on a previous presentation. So play parks. Then we moved into what we call the lookalike playgrounds and constructed spaces. This is a relatively new one built under the new government programme. I can't believe that they got the drainage so wrong on it. That, you know, after a bit of rain, the water is around the play equipment, so you can't even get to it. So this shows how bad we are at some of these things. This is nearly a kit fence park because it's got a kit and a fence, but it's got grass, and there's quite a lot of space. But unfortunately, the drainage is completely wrong, and I just can't believe that's happened. So these are all constructed spaces because they are very specifically made. This is where children should be. And we'll come back to that one. Okay, and we've talked about kit fence carpet, so I've rushed through that bit because we've seen some of that. And then how we can move to constructed spaces that have more natural elements. So this is one of the projects on our 3-year site where there wasn't very much money to do things, but we removed some of the fencing around the swings. Had an enormous discussion with the maintenance people about it. They wanted us to leave all the fencing in. It was really hard work to get them to allow us to take any of the fencing in, and this is one of the issues that you sometimes have to have a dialogue with the maintenance people as well. And here's other of our sites where small interventions can make quite a lot of difference. But these are all constructed spaces in the way that the traditional playgrounds, adventure playgrounds, they are built very specifically for children to be playing in. Here's some, I think this is in Sweden, where you can see it's quite different in its approach. There's a lot of sand underneath, though they have been worried about a drive to move towards having rubber surfacing. They really are concerned about it. But seating well included, big slides. Here's just something that's in the middle of a city centre, in fact. So it's just a small intervention, but it's a constructed space. It's designed for children playing. Now, another area of my research has been about skateboarders, and there are some very constructed spaces for them. This is in Rotterdam. It's a very interesting location because it's in the middle of the dual carriageway of a busy road. Now, we don't usually put active, or we don't usually encourage people to be in that part of a road, so this is a very interesting use. And it's very carefully designed with a lot of details. It is a very constructed space. In fact, see even the edges of these steps, because skateboarders like steps, are reinforced with steel so that it will not wear too quickly. And there's some seats. I don't know if there's a picture of one of the seats. So there's a ramp, and yes, I have included the picture of the seat. Can you see? Even that's got steel over it, so that it makes it durable for the skateboarders, because otherwise that creates damage. And that sort of damage is one of the concerns in some city centres. So skateboarders are very active. Here's another one I think in Berlin. This is in a German city anyway, I think somewhere. This is a much more of a concrete one, but very similar elements and a very robust construction. So it's made in a very particular way, and they have to be robust because they get a lot of hammering, as we would call it, from the skateboards themselves. And in our city, there is sometimes then a conflict between skateboarders and BMX bikers, so they like to use these spaces as well. But very simple elements in the landscape that are needed, but they attract a very particular sort of people. Here's one that's by the seaside, and if you don't know the origins of skateboarding, it developed from the west coast of America, where surfers got bored when there was no surf on the sea, so they started using empty swimming pools. They would go into people's big gardens and find the empty swimming pools and sort of surf in there. And those are the origins of skateboarding. So actually it's quite nice that I found one by a seaside. This is actually in our country, in the southwest of our country, where the local children, teenagers, predominantly boys skateboard, have got somewhere that they can go. And part of the issue of the constructed space of skate parks is they're often associated with graffiti, but it's an allowable activity in this sort of space. There are parts of our cities where we don't want graffiti to happen, but here it's fine because it's part of the culture. This is another one, graffiti all over the place, a rail specially to be here, loads and loads of graffiti and fenced in. There was one skateboard park built in one of our northern cities that the kids wanted to be using it even before it was finished. They were so desperate for this space. And the local authority was really worried because it wasn't insured until it was finished, and the kids were wanting to be on site, so the local authority was worried about it. But so very, this is one I saw recently in China. It looks slightly bizarre because this one mound here looks very steep. I suppose you use that side and then that side. It almost looks like you might want to go over it, but I'm not a skateboarder. I don't know if that's a challenge anybody would want to go for, but it was very different in my mind from ones I've seen before. And again, one in a town centre. So positioning them is very interesting, I think. But what we know about children is that they will play anywhere. They won't just play in the places that we say, this is where you should play. This is the place we have built for you. And here we are in our local park again, and children looking, there's a little boy looking down the drain and walking. It doesn't look like this is a wall, so walking on a wall. Children will use those small elements in the landscape to play. I think it's partly because they're closer to the ground, they're more adventurous sometimes than adults, and they're exploring their environment anyway. So we use this term found space as well, as opposed in opposition to what constructed space is. And some of you may know the work of Kevin Lynch, who talks about appropriation of space. He talks about lots of things, but one of the things he mentions is appropriation of space. And he says it's one of the 5 dimensions of spatial rights. And that's very interesting. We've just been having a discussion about privatisation of space. You know, can you still appropriate for public use space that has been privatised? I don't know. Others have used the term claim. So Carr and Ellis in their work, also out of America, talk about claiming space. And in some of our housing areas where we have this project with in 24 areas of social housing in our city, there were areas where some of the residents were appropriating some of this green space which was originally designed for everybody, but really nobody was using it. So it had become what I've called forgotten space. But they were appropriating it. If they were in the ground floor of the apartments, they would be perhaps turning it into a bit of a garden. And I think that's a good thing. It becomes a problem for the housing management team, but I think claiming or appropriating space like that is really very interesting. So I think that these two terms of appropriation and claim have a shared understanding that an individual or a group of people might use a space in a way that was not the original intention. And I relate these terms to the concepts of privacy and territoriality, so people claiming territory, but they can both be understood in light of Gibson's theory of affordance, which I'm sure some of you know of, which provides a framework for understanding that people do use spaces for activities other than for which those spaces were originally designed and intended. And so found space is something where people are appropriating or claiming the space for an activity that they did. Now, as I was writing this book chapter, I was thinking, oh, found space, who first used the term? Because sometimes it's like that. Who used this term first? So we did have a bit of a literature review and found, strangely enough, that it was a building term used in the 1970s, and it was because some higher education, so some universities in America, needed more space as their universities expanded. This was a complete surprise to me, that this is where this term seemed to have been used in the built environment professionals. And this seemed to relate particularly to industrial buildings, offices, commercial buildings, department stores, public buildings, residential buildings, agricultural buildings, former colleges. So basically the universities who were running out of space were using any other sorts of buildings they could actually find. So that's where the term originally came from. Then the term was used, and you might have heard of it in this context, with respect to homeless people. And again, this work came out of America, really. People are using visible spaces, so fronts of lobbies and buildings, but also what have been called invisible spaces, so transportation stations, alleys, empty buildings and apartments. And then sometimes libraries, cinemas, parks and benches have a use which is socially understood as the norm. So these are places that are used for particular purposes, but homeless people were using these found spaces. And these found space uses, these non-prescribed or non-expected uses, are sometimes deemed as inappropriate by other people who are managing the space. So if I just think of benches and seats in our peace gardens in the centre of our city, that where the lovely water feature is that children are playing in that I've shown you, before that was redesigned in the 1990s, it was a smaller green space with a little bit of bedding, bit of grass and some park benches. And those park benches used to be appropriated by homeless people, and it was something people became uncomfortable about because this wasn't good for the city centre. And this happens in a lot of city centre, so that rather than this becoming inclusive, it becomes exclusive as we gentrify things and redesign things, and that is very definitely what's happened. And what I will tell you is that Peace Garden is a very carefully managed and designed space, so that the people that we might think are inappropriate users are not allowed there, okay? But this happens in some of our parks. We had a couple of homeless people who used to sleep in our botanical gardens, and the botanical gardens is the only park in our city that gets locked up at night. And actually I think that the people in charge of it sort of overlooked it for a while, because they were, but then they did in the end have to move them out. And there is an issue of, there's a big social issue of what happens with homeless people in cities. Okay. So, found space then moved on to become an open space term, I believe. And it was about freedom of use from intrusion of spaces, freedom to do what an individual chooses, and somewhere to be safe. And this is some thinking from Leanne Rivlin, again out of America. So a lot of this thinking about what found space is has come from different backgrounds in America, really. So freedom to use and from intrusion, freedom to do what an individual wants to do, and safe. What I would say is that children have always, and they still use found spaces. They don't like to be just in playgrounds. And there are 3 pieces of work I want to mention just as references. You may already know of them, but there are these people who have given insights into how children used a multitude of different open spaces during the 1970s and 80s across a range of locations and contexts in the world. And the first of these is a book called The Child in the City by Colin Ward. Some of you nodding your head, do you know this piece of work? Have you been able to get hold of a copy? Okay. No? Have your libraries got them? They have, good. All of these books are now very hard to get hold of, but I think they hold a richness of information, some of it not as constructed as researchers we would do now, particularly not Colin Ward's book. It's a lot of observations, visits of different cities. I have a copy. I think I bought it when I was an undergraduate, so obviously that was so long ago. It was close enough to 1978 that they were still available at sale price, I think, as well. But it's very hard to get hold of now. But it's very interesting. And one of the things I love in his book is, as I say, an example in London where he photographs skateboarders, and it's a location where 40, 50, I can't work out how many years later, these skateboarders are still using the same place, the Undercroft on the South Bank. And in the last 2 or 3 years, they have had an enormous campaign because somebody wanted to come and develop this space, and they wanted to put posh cafes and things there. And the campaign has been massive. And in the end, they have saved this space. Okay, so this is a space that has not been privatised. It's stayed as a publicly used space. And you can go there, it's very vibrant, and tourists go and watch it. And people like me go and take photos because you feel you have to, because it's still there. So Colin Ward's book is very interesting. Then Roger Hart's book is called Children's Experience of Place. And I don't know if you've come across this. Basically, Roger Hart was an Englishman who went to America, works at City University in New York. He's a geographer. He has led a lot of the research and the drive for children's rights and has been involved with various UNICEF projects. I think he's less active now because he's a bit older. But he's still at the City University in New York, and his PhD basically children's experience of place is his PhD. And it's a very big book, it's that thick, and when I first tried to find a copy of it, it was hundreds of pounds, and I was like, oh no, but at one time I think I found it at a price I could afford, so I'm lucky enough to have a copy of this. And he was the first person who really started to take children, or go with children out into their environments to see where they were playing and what those found spaces were. He wasn't using the term found space, but really that's what he was doing.